Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker, and it's a Friday night in with Aaron Bastani. Aaron, how are you doing?
Very well, Michael. Well adjusted, well prepared, raring to go. Not the best of weather this week, but I'm hopeful for the weekend.
Is well adjusted something you're allowed to sort of declare? Can you sort of auto-declare that? Or is that not something that other people should be able to? But I do think you're a well-adjusted person. Coming up later in the show, we take a look at the upcoming elections in France, which see a fractured right and a united left. Unusual, very good to see, but it's really, really chaotic on the right. Keir Starmer is upset that people laugh when he mentions his dad was a toolmaker. For the millionth time, he might have missed the point, and well-off parents and journalists alike are upset that Keir Starmer might tax private schools. Rishi Sunak's worst nightmare has come to pass. Reform UK has overtaken the Tories in the polls. In the latest poll from YouGov, Reform UK are on 19%, with the Tories down to 18%. Labour are still way ahead on 37% of the vote. Now, that should come with the usual caveats. It's just one poll, and none of the other polling firms yet have the Tories in third place. But it's symbolically significant. And it came just in time for Nigel Farage to deliver this response in last night's TV debate.
Nigel is a Labour enabler.
Okay. Nigel,
and he is enabling no cap, no target and no plan.
Penny, let Nigel Farage come back.
I don't believe a single word that you say. You've deceived us with the last four manifestos. I don't believe you in the fifth. And as for being a Labour enabler, we are now ahead of you in the national polls.
OK, thank you.
A vote for you is actually now a vote for Labour.
So as we said, the caveat here is this is just one poll. We can't necessarily sort of infer from that Reform are genuinely ahead of the Conservatives in the country. Lots of the other pollsters tell a very different story. But it is symbolically important because obviously YouGov is a big pollster. It's not a sort of niche thing. And this does mean that Reform UK, Nigel Farage can say, look, we're the real opposition. Because when you get into a general election, what often happens is the bigger parties try and squeeze the votes of the smaller parties by saying there's no point voting for a smaller party. A vote for a smaller party is a waste. But if that supposedly smaller party is polling above you, then it's a harder argument to make. And, you know, that's what Nigel Farage sort of deployed very successfully there. Reform UK's claim, though, is that with them ahead of the Tories in this one poll, they are set to become the country's opposition. Right? So not just that we're above you in the polls, but this means we are set to become the country's opposition. However, that's not really how our electoral system works. If we had proportional representation, perhaps, but we don't. And it doesn't only matter what vote share you get, but also how that vote is distributed. And if you put the results from that YouGov poll into the Financial Times seat prediction model, this is what you get. So Reform would get only 11 seats compared to 31 for the Tories. And the official opposition would in fact be the Lib Dems with 98 seats. So that's with Reform ahead of the Conservatives in the nationwide polls, and still the Conservatives get 31 seats and Reform get 11. Even that sentence, the Conservatives get 31 seats, is quite incredible, right? This is supposed to be the most successful party ever in the Western world, and they might be on 31 seats out of 650. Nigel Farage is, as you can imagine, remaining cagey on the question of how many seats Reform could actually win.
The Labour Party are massively ahead in the polls. The Conservative Party have not bounced one little bit in these first 3 weeks. They're not going to. And my message is very simple, that Starmer's going to have a very big majority. I don't think he has much of a plan. His 6 priorities didn't even mention legal migration, which is a huge issue. So I want us to become the opposition voice in Parliament and in the country. That's the ambition.
But you must have a target for seats.
I've got no idea.
Why not? You're the leader.
Because I'm travelling optimistically.
But, OK, but people
I have no targets.
If you say you're going to be a credible opposition, or you want to be a credible opposition, you will need seats. So how many? We're
going to win seats. How many? I don't know. If this momentum continues, at the moment, we're rising 1% a day in the polls. That's been pretty consistent over the last 10 days. If that continues, who's to say?
So obviously, if he says we're going to be the real opposition, and you know, at most we're looking at 30 seats, it doesn't sound that impressive. So he's trying to sort of suppress that conversation. Let's look at vote share in the polls. Let's not look at how many seats we'd actually have. Rishi Sunak is fighting back He's in a fighting spirit. He told journalists at the G7 this. We're only halfway through this election, right? So I'm still fighting very hard for every vote. I always say the poll that matters is the one on the 4th of July. But if that poll was replicated on the 4th of July, it would be handing Labour a blank cheque to tax everyone, tax their homes, their pension, their car, their family. And I'll be fighting very hard to make sure that doesn't happen. And actually, when I've been out and about talking to people, they do understand that a vote for anyone who's not a Conservative candidate is just a vote for Keir Starmer in number 10. That message was repeated by Minister Laura Trott at a Tory campaign rally.
The poll is a stark warning. If a result like this is replicated on election day, Keir Starmer would have huge and unchecked power to tax your home, your job, your car, your pension, however he wants. And we're fighting for every vote. And I know from my own conversations with voters that the choice is very clear. A vote for anyone other than Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives is a vote for Keir Starmer as Prime Minister.
So that's the line from the Conservatives. Nigel Farage, though, has been speaking at his own rally.
A Conservative vote in the Red Wall is now a wasted vote. We are the challengers to Labour. We are now the real opposition. And this needs to be reflected. As I said, it's beginning to be reflected by the polling industry, but it needs to be reflected by the broadcasters as well. Because Ofcom, on the guidance they've given to broadcasters, say that really the most important of all the factors is the performance in the last two general elections. We haven't stood in the last two general elections. It's as if everything about our politics is designed to stop new boys and girls coming in and to keep everything the same. At the moment, broadcasters are giving our party 8% of their coverage, which clearly is nowhere near in line with where we actually are. But there's something else I want to ask for today. The BBC will be having a leaders' debate, a four-way leaders' debate with the leader of the Liberal Democrats, the Conservatives, Labour and the SNP. And that takes place next week. And I think we can demand of right now that the BBC put us into that debate.
Nigel Farage has also tweeted that he would like a one-on-one debate with Keir Starmer and that he would like to sort of be the third person in the head-to-head debate that Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak are set to attend in the week before the election. Aaron, how significant is this YouGov poll that put Reform 1 point ahead of the Conservatives?
Hugely significant. Of course, it was on the same day, as you've already said, as this debate that we covered here on Novara Media last night, Moira and I. So from PR and media perspective, it's very important. And that line that he said to Penny Mordaunt of actually voting for the Tories is the wasted vote, because in many seats, and this is probably true, by the way, in the Red Wall, for instance, his party, Reform, I was about to say the Brexit party, his party, Reform, is probably trailing second. So actually many of those seats, if you want to keep Labour out, by the way, it's not going to work in all of them, your best bet's Reform. So from that point of view, it's very important to restructure this whole conversation away from it being a wasted vote. Clearly, if the Tories are now trending in the high teens, it's not a wasted vote. There was that line from Grant Shapps recently about having to stop a Labour supermajority. And I actually think lots of voters are now pricing that in. They're not just pricing in a Labour majority, they're pricing in a Labour supermajority, certainly bigger than the 2019 majority of the Tories. Look, there's 2.5 weeks to go. That might not come to pass, but that's what the polling shows. And when I've done Vox Pops, okay, only in 4 seats, I'm universally hearing the same things. Very few people are saying, I'm going to vote the Tories in to keep Labour out. The people still voting for the Tories say, I've done it all my life, even if I hate them. And occasionally, people say they've done a good job. They were dealt a bad hand. Very few of them are saying, I need to keep Labour out by voting Tory. I'm sure it exists, but it's not a huge vote like it was, say, in 2015, which powered, of course, David Cameron to that small majority over at Miliband. So I think it's really, really significant. And just that video a moment ago, Nigel Farage, Michael, didn't he look, I hate to use the word, statesman-like? He looked authoritative. He looked like a Westminster politician. That's very hard for somebody who, for 20 years, has actively posed as an outsider, an insurgent. But he seems to be transitioning quite well from one to the other. You know, it's something that Jeremy Corbyn struggled with. It's something that many politicians struggle with. How do you go from being the outsider, the populist, throwing stones at the establishment, to all of a sudden looking like you belong there? And again, I might not please many people watching or listening to this by saying as much, but I think he fits in, right? Which isn't particularly hard because after all, he's basically he's just an establishment conservative in many ways. So I think this is a major inflection point for him. That said, in all probability, not possibility, the Tories will still get a higher percentage than Reform. We've seen this before in 1983 when the SDP were trailing the Tories and Labour, and then during the election campaign they did pretty well. Turned out actually they got a slightly smaller share of the vote than Labour, but got massively fewer MPs. I suspect the real bar of success for Farage, frankly, is getting more than 10%, getting more actually than UKIP got in 2015, so 4 million votes, and him becoming an MP. If they do that, it's mission accomplished.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. Something to build on for the next general election. Or once he's an MP, he can try and join the Conservatives and then become the Conservative leader, which does seem to be part of the plan. You tweeted today, Aaron, that Farage was getting some pretty softball questions in big interviews. And you shared this clip here.
Do you think then that you are more patriotic than the other party leaders?
Without a doubt.
What's your evidence for that?
D-Day. D-Day does it for me. I mean, it's very interesting.
I did say
Keir Starmer.
I did say the other party leaders.
Yeah,
and I'm putting you're here as a party leader. We will be speaking to all the party leaders. You are sitting here saying, hold on, let me just finish the question if I may. You are saying you are more patriotic than any of the other party leaders who are standing in this general election. On what basis?
I wouldn't take my poppy off out of embarrassment, because that's what Keir Starmer did last year. Please ask him when he's here why, at one point in the morning, is he wearing a poppy, and at another moment, speaking to a Muslim community, he takes the poppy off.
And that is your evidence for saying you're more patriotic?
I reckon that's pretty strong, don't you?
And that could almost have been a planted question. Aaron, why were you so struck by that sort of clip and that question answer?
Michael, I'm puzzled why legacy media, mainstream media, the people that get, millions of eyeballs a day as to millions of eyeballs a month like we get here on Novara Media, I'm puzzled why they keep on, a cricket term, they keep on giving the guy dollies. It's just, here you go. They're throwing little satsumas and he can catch them like a little 4-year-old in primary school, very easy dolly catches. Well done, well done. Encouraging him. They're giving him questions about patriotism and immigration. I don't understand why. Again, you might not agree with him, but the people that Farage resonates with are because of those issues, right? This is like asking Jeremy Corbyn infinity questions about food banks and greedy banks and greedy corporations and inequality and bankers' bonuses. And those are all the questions that Farage gets. He's on home territory all the time, just knocking it away. Boom, boom, boom. Here's the thing, Michael. Nigel Farage on public services, on the role of the state, on the role of the market, on the big challenges of the 21st century, really is very close to Liz Truss. And I find it utterly remarkable that according to YouGov, the country's most popular politician, which he is, by the way, 38%, you can have many people dislike you, but still be very popular. The country's most popular politician, actually, on the big questions of the day, agrees with the country's most unpopular politician, Liz Truss, and yet, on the several areas where he's very comfortable, immigration, patriotism, the poppy, that's where the media keeps him going. It doesn't make sense to me. Maybe they're trying to do something which nobody's ever done before, which is to make Farage look stupid on immigration or patriotism. Like, it's not going to work. People have tried that for 20 years. Ask him why, on the day of the budget, which crashed this country's economy, ask him why he tweeted, "This is the country's best budget since 1987. That's the question you ask, because it shows how out of touch he is with so much of the public. But for some reason, the media is addicted to asking dolly questions, and he's just catching them. He's lapping it up like a professional juggler.
That is absolutely right. I actually didn't know that he tweeted that on the day of Liz Truss's mini budget. That should be completely toxic. I mean, I was really surprised where in that first 7-way debate, he sort of said that the NHS is a model that doesn't work. Like, you don't say that in British politics. And if he had, if in all of these interviews that was what was being bandied at him, that look, you don't like the NHS, as you said there, Aaron, you thought Liz Truss's mini budget was the best thing that ever happened to this country in years. Why are you someone who could, represent people? And you don't want to just be a protest party now. You want to be a party of opposition and then potentially government. You're going to have more than just, I don't like migrants and I'm patriotic. But yeah, He didn't even, I don't know, it didn't even seem like he was trying to catch him out. So you think you're more patriotic than the other party leaders, do you? Explain why. And then Nigel Farage explained why. And he was like, oh, interesting. Well, that's the end of the interview. It's like, what? Let's talk about Labour. Aaron, as you said, people seem to be sort of pricing in a big Labour majority. The message from the Tories is that with a big majority, Labour would become more radical. That's certainly not obvious, though. Patrick Maguire at the Times had an interesting article on this today. He said, a Labour supermajority doesn't mean red alert. Far from unleashing hard socialism, party bigwigs such as Pat McFadden will want to implement public sector reform. So Pat McFadden is the Shadow Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, so that job that Michael Gove did for a while. He's also Labour's joint campaign coordinator, and he's known to have a lot of power and influence in Starmer's team, and he's a Blairite through and through. He has no intention of veering a Starmer government to the left, and he's not alone. Maguire ends the article by saying this: if the prevailing voices at the commanding heights of a Labour government are those of Reeves, McFadden, McSweeney, Streeting, and others like Bridget Phillipson, the incoming Education Secretary, and Shabana Mahmood, who will be Justice Secretary, this will not be a government that interprets its mandate as a blank cheque to the broad left. Just look at their manifesto. Instead, it will take it as a license to offend and disappoint them. And I think that's an important point, isn't it, Aaron? Sort of the bigger the majority Starmer gets, that's not going to be, oh, great, that means I can be a little bit more left-wing, sort of challenge the powers that be. A big majority means they can completely ignore the Socialist Campaign Group and they can say, look, you guys lost. We've won the biggest majority ever. And we're going to implement our politics, which is essentially very centrist, you might call it centre-right, centre-left politics. In terms of sort of the McSweeneys of the world, it does just seem quite right-wing, Pat McFadden as well. I mean, how do you think they'll respond to a very big majority?
I agree almost entirely with what you just said and with what was written in the Times. I think that's right. And look, with some justification, right? They can say, we've just won a majority of 150 or whatever it's going to be. Shut up. What do you know? You can say that. You've earned that right. However, the sort of centrist, we're just going to sort of manage things approach, it can work when the fundamentals of the economy are very good. That's not what they're going to inherit. And they know that. I mean, they do know that. So, you know, there's a big deficit. There's, frankly, austerity is embedded into their manifesto far more than what Cameron actually implemented after 2010. And of course, the response from them is, well, we'll grow the economy. We'll grow the economy. Very easy to say, of course, much harder to do. So there are some inconsistencies there as well. And also, I'd throw a few things back to what Patrick Maguire said there. So on one, we saw a glimpse of this in the debate last night. Nigel Farage asked about whether or not he would get rid of the two-child benefit cap. He said, of course I would. That's because he loves being popular. He loves being popular. And by the way, when you speak to Reform Party curious people, they say we want lower immigration. And you say, well, look, there are labour shortages. And they say, well, we should have more children then. That's what they say. And I suspect in the last couple of years, Farage has kind of heard that natalism repeatedly. He does listen to his base. That's the thing, Michael. He really listens to his base. Lots of politicians could learn a lesson from that. You know, and I think that all of a sudden, something like Farage or politicians on the left in the Socialist Campaign Group or wherever, on something like the two-child benefit cap, are actually far more in tune with the public than this Labour Party with a massive majority. So, I mean, that's one example there where they can think that, and I'm sure they'd like to think that, but the challenges will be very big. And there will be many parties to their left nibbling at them in terms of the wider discourse. So the Lib Dems, the Greens, Plaid, the SNP, they will all be saying broadly the same thing with regards to public sector cuts, or austerity, or not giving working people a better deal. And of course, you've got the right populists like Farage, who understands that there's a big part of his voter base which actually is quite economically, you know, unitarian. Not that he is, but I think he recognizes some of those people are. So I'm not so sure about that. Then finally, I wouldn't be surprised if a Starmer government with a big majority did things which were hugely unpopular, but actually they should happen. Council tax reform. I don't know why I feel this way, Michael, but it's almost like Rachel Reeves, if there's a 200 majority, she's got that personality type where I can see her saying, it's dysfunctional, it doesn't work, we need to do it, we need to get rid of it. And they've done things before which fly in the face of the approach talked about there by the Times. You know, the VAT on private schools, for instance, is not something you'd associate with that McFadden approach. So they may do things actually which people aren't talking about, which are very big, very important and very interesting, like reform of council tax. And I suspect capital gains tax increases. What they're going to do is, Michael, my view, they'll come into government, they'll wait a month, 2 months, they'll concoct a crisis where they'll say, look, the books, we've opened up the books, it's far worse than we thought. And they're going to have to announce, I suspect, several tax rises. That's my view. Might not happen because otherwise the numbers in their manifesto simply don't add up. And I say many things about people on the Labour benches, but I think some of them are smart enough to know that if they did inflict austerity harsh enough to 2010, that majority would basically go on a bonfire. So, yes, I expect radicalism in very strange places, not necessarily, areas that left populists might ask for it. But like I say, capital gains and maybe council tax reform too.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. Council tax reform is it sounds very nerdy, doesn't it? But it's that they haven't revalued people's homes since 1992. So you can be paying really low council tax, even if you're in sort of a house which is worth like £1 million in London, because in 1992 it wasn't worth very much. They do need to change that. But obviously it's very difficult to do anything which increases some people's taxes based on the price of their home, because then the right-wing press go up in arms. With the Tories and reform at each other's throats, UK politics might seem particularly chaotic. But it's got nothing on what's happening right now in France. On Monday, French President Emmanuel Macron responded to poor European election results by calling a snap election to the nation's parliament. He hoped to amass a centrist coalition to see down the far right who had come first in those European elections. But it's not going to plan. First off, instead of rallying behind Macron, the centre-left parties have allied with the further left parties, including France Insoumise, that's the party of Jean-Luc Mélenchon. The new Popular Front includes Macron's old party, the Socialists, whose leader said this at the launch of the alliance.
After those technocratic governments, we can make sure that the representatives of the workers can actually enter government, making sure that the movement that we're creating shall be a new way of looking at politics.
It's, of course, a relief to see the left get it together to put their differences aside. And the new Popular Front is currently polling at 30%. Macron's party, in contrast, is languishing on 18%. Meanwhile, the centre-right have gone into complete meltdown. On Tuesday, Éric Ciotti, the leader of the main centre-right party Les Républicains, said he wanted an alliance with the far-right National Rally. Now, that would have been the first time ever that a mainstream French party allied with the far-right, so it would have been a big deal. But not everyone in Les Républicains agreed. Gérard Larcher is the party's president in the French Senate. He tweeted this: "Following the declarations of Ciotti, I believe that he can no longer chair our movement and must resign from his mandate as president of Les Républicains." In response, Éric Ciotti locked himself inside the party's headquarters. Now, that led to fairly amusing scenes of leading members of the French centre-right giving interviews to the media outside their party's own locked doors. This is Aurélien Pradi, a Republican MP, saying they'll get emergency services to break open the door for them. The emergency services ended up not being necessary. The impasse was resolved when the party general secretary emerged with a pair of spare keys. As of today, the leadership of Les Républicains has twice voted to remove Ciotti from his post, but he has continued to insist he is still, in fact, the party's president, and a Paris court was due to rule on the case this evening. Joining me now from Paris is Alice Capel, a French journalist and very popular YouTuber. Let's start with the chaos in the Republican Party. So this is the party of Sarkozy, of Chirac. You know, it's a big part of sort of the French establishment. Has it completely imploded?
Thank you for having me on. And I really appreciate that you started with this, because this is it's been kind of chaotic in the past few days. And just seeing those videos was so funny, honestly. And there've been a lot of like memes and everything created around those videos. And actually, the last little video that you should have shown is the video of him actually going into the office the next day, and they removed everything in his office. There's no computer, nothing, and he's just sitting there on an empty office and being like, yeah, back to work now. It's just such a kind of crazy situation. But I mean, on a more serious note, like it's kind of scary because it's revealing of how the right and the far right, because he's one of those Republican party members who are willing to build coalitions with the far right. Those people, like, we know when they take power, we're never sure of when they give it back. And I feel like that was a good example of that.
And the left is very famous, across the world for sort of splitting a lot, for struggling to put aside their differences. And I know that actually when Macron sort of called this election, I saw lots of people who I very much respect sort of saying there is absolutely no chance that the left are going to get it together in time for this election. But I think within a day, actually, of Macron announcing this election, there was a united left, which is now polling fairly well. So is that a cause for hope?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I mean, in 4 days, they had the coalition, they had the agreement, and they had some key propositions to make to the French people, to the French electorate. So this is super nice. This is really like, we're really hopeful on the left in France at the moment. But now we're going to have to get to work because everything that happened in Paris. So we were talking about the leaders, etc. Now we're going to have to go everywhere in the country and really win the seats, build those campaigns, go door to door, and everything. And people are really motivated, which is great. But yeah, it was kind of funny to see the whole thing because the media has been, I think it's the same thing in the UK. Like the media coverage of the left, or the way they kind of present the left, they always try to divide the left as much as possible. And it was very much the case here as well. So it was like, oh, are you really going to be able to build a coalition? They invited all the figures that were kind of controversial because throughout the European election campaigns, there were two influential people in the left who really fought quite hard. So we're talking about Klugsman, who is part of the socialist group, the Parti Socialiste, so the Social Democrats, let's say. And then you had Mélenchon, who's kind of like our Corbyn, let's say, the French version of a Corbyn, so way more aggressive, I would say. And these two didn't really get along. So there was this tension, and the media tried to build on this tension, but they overcame it. So that's really good. We're really hopeful, and we hope that the union is going to keep going. We have another figure as well that is not too popular in international media, but is kind of rising, and people are really like projecting themselves into this guy, like people on the left. We're talking about François Ruffin. And Ruffin embodies someone who spent a lot of time on the ground. He's very much this left-wing figure that could sort of reunite the two left. We often talk about the urban left versus like the more working class left, the countryside left. So he's someone who can build that union. And the fact that the entire union, the Front Populaire, so the Popular Front, is kind of organized again around him makes a lot of sense. And we're really hopeful, to be honest.
And then on the far right, there's also been sort of drama, hasn't there? Because you've got these two far right parties. So the biggest one is the National Assembly, or the National Rally, which used to be the National Front. That's headed by Le Pen. And then you've got Zemmour's party. So Zemmour also on the far right, but he sort of came from a journalistic background. And as far as I understand, they're struggling to form an alliance. What's going on there?
Again, a little family drama this time. So basically, like the candidate for the European elections of Zemmour's party, so like we're talking about the far right of the far right, she's the niece of Marine Le Pen. And a few years ago, she separated from Marine Le Pen to join Zemmour. So she wanted something more, she wanted to go more towards the far right. And now she's talking to Marine Le Pen again and maybe building a new coalition. That's what they're doing at the moment. And Zemmour does not like that. So everywhere on the right, there are betrayals happening. You showed some of the videos of the Republicans, fighting each other, etc. So the right is very much chaotic. The left is very united. And this is clearly not what people expected. But it's kind of funny to watch as a French citizen.
And so we've done the left, we've done the right. What about the centre? Obviously, Macron, I assume, sort of seemed to think that he could get some Republican, sort of in the French sense, not in the American sense, a Republican coalition together to sort of see down the anti-Republican far right. Is anyone lying behind Macron, or is sort of everyone just sort of saying, I don't want to have anything to do with this guy, we're going our own way?
I guess like among the party, the Republicans, which is the right-wing party, you have people who have more of a center-right sensibility and who could come closer to Macron, but we haven't heard about any specific alliances, or maybe on-the-ground alliances will happen. But yeah, other than that, like, I'm not sure people really want to associate with Macron at this point, especially with what he's done, dissolving the assembly, giving the far right the opportunity to put a prime minister, like to select a prime minister. Like this is pretty insane. And I've seen the coverage of what is happening in France abroad. People are kind of skeptical, don't really understand like the logic behind what Macron did there. Some people hypothesize that in France, some people hypothesize that maybe he wants to get a far right prime minister to show that they can't govern, they're not good at it, and therefore maybe prepare the next election. That would be maybe a strategy. We're not really sure. Like nobody really understands what's going on, why he chose to do this. But the fact is that we only have 2 to 3 weeks to organize the campaign, to maybe create a little bit of hope, bring a little hope to this country, and avoid to have the far right in power. But even just that, like giving only 2 to 3 weeks, is it really democratic? Like, is it really in alignment with the idea of like the debate and confrontation and building a campaign and blah, blah, blah. So Macron was, I mean, it's just another way of showing that he doesn't really care about democracy. Like he's shown that throughout his 2 mandates. This is just another example of that.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting way of putting it, actually. Some people are reading it as him being ultimately democratic, but doing it so quickly sort of shows maybe that's not what's really going on. Alice Capel, thank you so much for that crash course in a pretty crazy week in French politics. I'm sure we'll be speaking to you again as this election progresses. Won't somebody please think of the private school children? The Labour Party say they will charge VAT on private schools as soon as possible if they win this election. And the right-wing media has been awash with hysterical takes. This was the Telegraph today. This is really good. Labour's private school VAT plan could hit rural areas like 1980s pit closures. So the story was a report on an open letter to Keir Starmer from the head teacher of Claysmore School in Dorset, who warned about rural job losses. And that open letter said this: many independent schools, like those mines once were, are the lifeblood of small communities. Like most independent schools in the UK, we do not educate the Jacob Rees-Moggs or the Boris Johnsons of this world. Now, Claysmore charges parents £9,500 per term to send their children to its sixth form, or £13,000 per term for boarding. So I'm not entirely convinced that closing a school would lead to a cycle of poverty and destitution on the scale of County Durham in the 1980s. Right? That private school teachers are not the new miners. It's not just the head teachers, though, who are up in arms. Private school parents are also pretty angry. This was the Sky News leaders' debate on Wednesday evening.
So I'm an average working parent from London, and I send my daughter to a private school, which in turn saves the government about £7,500 per year. But by now having to pay 20% VAT, we would be priced out, and we would have to send our children to state school. It in fact beats the objective of collecting tax. Rather, it increases the influx in public schools. So private schools is not only for the rich. I mean, the rich would continue sending their children. It's us who would have to make the change. And the ultimate losers in all of this are the children, who are meant to be our futures.
Somebody think of the children who are in the between the 6% and 7% richest in the country. So we keep hearing this argument again. It's actually not progressive to tax VAT on private schools, because the top 5% will still go to private school, but it's the top 6 to 7%, or people who are between the 6 and 7%ness of richness, they're the ones who will have to sacrifice and go to a local state school. Just an average working family. If you're one of the 7% of parents who send your kids to private school, you are by definition not an average working parent. You are an wealthier than average working parent. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to afford private school fees. BBC Question Time also featured, this time, a particularly posh parent in distress.
I worked
hard to send my 3 children to a day school that was private. And I feel that by adding on VAT, you're going to get only the people that can absolutely afford it, which in half of your private schools are coming from abroad. They're not in this country. And I feel that it's quite wrong to take the opportunity from people like myself who want to work hard to try and achieve that. I certainly would never have been able to if there was 20% VAT on it.
I certainly would never have been able to if there were 20% VAT on it. I feel, poor lady. Again, that time is so. The first one we showed you was saying all the really rich are still going to be able to send their kids to private school. It's just the somewhat rich who are going to be punished. She's saying it's those rich foreigners who are still going to be able to go to our public schools. It's rich Brits who are no longer going to be able to afford to. It gets better though. Today, the Daily Mail published a ghost-written article by a teenage private school boy who told of his fears of being condemned to go to a ghastly state school. So the headline reads, "My fears at being forced into a state school by Labour's new class war." And in the article, the anonymous teenager writes this. So that's the headline there. "My fears at being forced into a state school by Labour's new class war." And this is the article. "Until now, me and my brother, he's 16, I'm 14, have always attended private school. I'm told the annual fees amount to more than 30,000 a year for both of us. And as a family, we've had to do without things like foreign holidays or a large home in order to manage this." I don't believe they have not had any foreign holidays. Whenever they say this, I just think it's a lie. Here's some more from that article. "It's beginning to dawn on me that I could be sitting next to pupils who don't care about doing well, who sneer when I put my hand up or ask or answer questions, and worst case scenario, may even carry a knife or drugs in their school places." I mean, this is a really good argument against private school, right? Because you've got a kid who goes to private school who thinks that if you go into a state school, then the average person you're sitting next to is going to sneer if you put your hand up and might be carrying a knife or have drugs in their school blazer. Right? This is just, we are creating a generation of people, well, not a generation, we're creating a 7% slice of a generation who are just so insanely out of touch that they sort of think this is what a state school is like. The anonymous child later goes on to write, "I don't want this to be misconstrued as me saying that everyone in state school is a thug or disinterested in education, because that's far from true. Just quite a lot of them are. Not all of them, but it's just, you're going to have a high probability of sitting next to someone with drugs and knives in their blazer if I were to be sent to my local state school." And they continue, oh my God, "What if I'm shamed into submission and stop asking questions in class? What if the teachers don't have time to speak to me one-to-one? Will my private school friends look down on me for going to a state school?" Well, they will if they've got this crazy ass attitudes that you've got. "How will my aspirations to be an investment banker be perceived? Will other teens put me under pressure to try drugs or vape in order to be accepted?" I really like that article. Aaron, I think that this policy from the Labour Party has been an absolute winner, right? This is exactly the argument you want to be having, because it's a policy that only affects 7% of the public, and when people, try and speak in opposition to it, they sound so ridiculous. It's just, it's gold dust politically, really.
Yeah, I just want to say, Michael, if I had a 14-year-old son, and they were saying that crap, I would disown them. I would say, you know what, maybe we picked up the wrong baby in the hospital all those years ago. It's just ridiculous. The best education you can have in life is to be around different kinds of people. It's really important, actually. It's a really important life skill to be around people that, are going to disagree with you or be different to you, and learn how to manage your expectations, learn how to manage their personalities, learn how to collaborate with them. That's like a really important skill. We talk about resilience, right? That's all parents talk about, and schools talk about our resilience. But apparently this kid's like, I can't go to a school where everybody isn't like me. Ridiculous, utterly ridiculous. And like you say, it's really an expression of a broader response, which is absurd. Funnily enough, on the drugs point, Michael, there was a study in the United States few years ago now, and they found that children that went to the most expensive private schools on reaching adulthood were 3 times more likely to have an addiction to alcohol or drugs than children who didn't go to those schools. Interesting. Also, rates of suicide, for instance, amongst the most expensive private schools in this country, quite high. So this idea that you're somehow insulated from drugs if you go to an expensive school is so utterly outlandish. I mean, it really is laughable. The idea that also a 14-year-old wants to be an investment banker, I mean, again, I just find it sort of strange. I find it very strange. More importantly, Michael, what we're talking about here is a tax break. It is a tax break for schools that's going to end. And look, we've criticised many things about Keir Starmer and this manifesto from Labour in recent days. This is a good policy. Even if it raised 0 money, it's a good policy. It will raise some money, probably not as much as they're saying, but it will raise some money. Let's say $500 million. You know, it's going to raise somewhere between 2 billion and 0. I think 2 billion is the top end. Nobody thinks that because of the costs that gentleman on TV talked about. Some people will leave the private sector, go into the state sector. It's going to raise some money. But even if it didn't raise anything, it's a good policy. Why? Well, it's really important that kids who are in, you know, stable homes, great families, really aspirational, really with it, really being pushed on, it's really good for those kids to be in state schools. It really helps bring up like standards. That's something which has been very well documented. So that's the first thing. Secondly, you do have, like you've said, 7% of the population. And look, the kids don't choose this. It's not a criticism of them, apart from this 14-year-old. But you do have 7% of the population who are fundamentally paying for social networks later in life. And that has massive negative externalities for the economy more broadly. If we had a state education system in this country which was doing really well, really successful, I would maybe understand these arguments a little bit better. But here are the facts. Around 45% of secondary schools in this country have had some maths lessons, not all, but some at least. 45% have had some maths lessons taught by teachers who are maths. 45% of secondary schools. I think, given that, every single measure should be taken to end that and to fund it. Labour is saying, well, we're going to end it through the imposition of VAT and ending this tax break on private schools. By the way, I don't think that's going to be good enough, but you know what? It's a start. So I think it's absolutely outlandish. We're hearing from people that, oh my God, it's awful. I'll be next to kids who are going to be normal, regular, working class kids, as if that's appalling. As if that somehow matters more than the fact that in secondary schools, 45% of those schools have at least some maths being taught by people who aren't maths teachers. That is the real thing that people should be disgusted by, not just a regular kid. Oh my God, maybe their parents live in a terraced or attached house, or maybe they live in a flat. Come on. So look, like I say, we've criticised Labour on many aspects of its manifesto. This is a very good policy. And I think the political response, like you say, Michael, forget the policy, but the political response is manna from heaven for Keir Starmer. There are other policies like it, by the way, which would also be very popular. Labour haven't gone down that road. We spoke a moment ago about how actually they won't go left in office. I'd be really interested actually on that. You know, if this does poll very well, but if it's executed well, if it does well, let's see. You know, that gentleman, again, just to finish, that South Asian gentleman talking about he won't be able to keep his kids in private schools because of the imposition of VAT. And then the lady after him saying, well, actually, loads of the kids are coming from abroad. Right, they can afford it. Well, you know what? Okay, fine. Really? They're not that sensitive to price? Well, you know what? We need to raise some more money. Thank you for the suggestion. Let's throw a new tax on them as well. So these aren't counter arguments. If anything, they're underscoring why this should happen and why this tax break should end.
This stuff ends up in our newspapers. Why is it the case that we see these articles that suggest that while some in this country have to choose between eating or heating, the real tragedy is some have to choose between Eton or a fortnight on the Algarve. That's really the message of this article from this 14-year-old. Now, of course, we shouldn't go too hard on the 14-year-old who gave their thoughts to a ghostwriter. You know, maybe they'll mature as they get older or when they go into a state school if they do actually have to drop out. But the Daily Mail's decision to publish it says more about them than it does about public opinion. Of course, Labour would never introduce a policy that hadn't been focus grouped to within an inch of its life. And a YouGov survey from January showed that 62% of respondents supported charging private schools VAT. Only 21% were against. But among those who are against taxing private schools, there are likely to be a lot of journalists. Britain's newsrooms are full of private school alumni. In 2019, the Sutton Trust surveyed the educational background of the news media. Here's what they found. So 40% of newspaper columnists went to private schools, as did 29% of BBC executive. That's compared to just 7% of the general population. So if you're wondering how this whining nonsense makes it into the pages of our national press, well, that might be why. Keir Starmer has hit back at the audience members who laughed at him saying his dad was a toolmaker. This was the moment in question.
When I grew up, my dad was a toolmaker. He worked in a factory. It's true.
It's true. No one was laughing because they thought it wasn't true. They were laughing because Keir Starmer says over and over and over again, my dad was a toolmaker. We did our live coverage of that Sky News event and we had a bingo card and my dad was a toolmaker was our number one line that we knew Keir Starmer was going to say. So people laugh at that because it does come across as a bit ridiculous when you have a politician who just keeps repeating the same thing over and over and over again. But this is how Keir Starmer spoke about that moment on GB News.
Looking at last night's debate with Sky News, the crowd laughed when he said, your dad's a toolmaker. Why is that? Do you think you've got nothing more to say? Are they getting tired of the same comment?
Let me directly address you on that. My dad worked in a factory all his life. He felt people disrespected him.
Oh.
And
that's not happening with the laughing.
I do want to see this through because it actually hit a nerve last night.
Yeah.
Because he felt that in the usual conversation, when someone says, what do you do for a living, socially, he would say, I work in a factory. And there'd be a pause where nobody quite knew what to say. And he felt really disrespected. It caused him in his life to withdraw from social engagements. He didn't do it much later in life because it was raw to him that he should be disrespected because he worked in a factory. So when someone laughed last night, my dad would have turned in his grave.
Was that a bit of snobbishness towards your dad, do you think?
I don't know what caused someone to laugh.
No.
But if you're laughing at someone because they work in a factory, then that is the one thing that I think had a massive impact on someone like my dad, the disrespect. And it's in me. You can see I'm angry about it. I'm frustrated because I will never allow that sort of disrespect for working people to be any part of my plans, any part of the Britain that I want as the future. So I will proudly tell anybody who will listen that my dad worked in a factory. He was a toolmaker, a very good toolmaker. He loved his trade. My mum was a nurse and she loved being a nurse and we didn't have a lot of money. And I'm proud of what my parents did. And yes, I don't like it when people laugh at my dad because he worked in a factory.
Quite right.
He wasn't laughing at your dad because he worked in a factory. He was laughing at you because, I mean, as you said in that interview, whenever you get the chance, you say, my dad was a toolmaker and my mum was a nurse. Everyone knows it by now, right? I also love this sort of politician thing he does where he's asked this question. He says, let me address this directly, right? Let me address this directly by completely changing the subject, right? The journalists are, I don't actually know why he didn't push a little bit harder because he was saying that he began sort of by saying he wasn't laughing at your dad working in a factory. He's laughing because you say this all the time. And he's like, no, let me address this directly. People used to disrespect it's like, he wasn't disrespecting your dad. Aaron, is this, on one level, that was, a clever communication strategy, very dishonest, but he's saying, let me address this directly. I'm going to talk about what I want to talk about, even though I'm going to completely actually misconstrue the person in the audience. I think a journalist needs to go and find the person in the audience who hopefully also works in a factory. They can say, I obviously was not disrespecting his dad because he worked in a factory. I was laughing because he just keeps on repeating the same thing over and over again. What do you make of this whole thing?
It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. I mean, my dad had a number of jobs. He was a sheet metal worker. He was a security guard. He worked at a kebab shop. He's a taxi driver. Like, I'm sure he's had other jobs too. It's just what he did, you know. He ran a pizza shop for a bit. That's what you do. Like, you have a job. I don't get it. I mean, maybe I'm unusual. I don't know. And maybe, you know, Keir Starmer's 60. We have to remember that, right? Maybe the world changed. I don't think like being a factory. I don't know. Toolmaker, it's a respectable blue collar job. I don't get it. I think it's maybe he doesn't remember things properly, or maybe there was a chip on his dad's shoulder which he inherited. You know, we misremember things, or we don't necessarily remember things with the fullest clarity. But what we do know is, because it happened this week, the guy wasn't laughing at him and he wasn't mocking or deriding his father. This is utterly ridiculous. And I think if Keir Starmer actually believes that, and I don't think he does, but if he actually believes that, I think he needs to see a therapist. Right? There's something quite strange going on. And that's obvious. He's an intelligent man. I mean, he knows why that person's laughing, surely. And if he doesn't, like I say, I think there's something a bit deeper going on there, Michael. It's a shame he wasn't pushed back on that in the interview, but there we are. It is odd, and I find the man rather strange. But with all his idiosyncrasies, you know, he's going to win a very large majority. So again, maybe this plays well with voters that we're not aware of, Michael. I mean, I suspect that he is probably overcooking it, but at the same time, there's the counter argument, which is not entirely false, that, you know, the fact that people are now laughing at him for saying this indicates that it's really cut through. And frankly, if you don't repeat that kind of stuff, then the Tories will say that, you know, Keir Starmer is incredibly rich. They would literally make up all kinds of things about him. So I understand where the impetus for repeating yourself ad nauseum comes from, of course. We saw, by the way, the other night, Penny Mordaunt saying that Labour would increase capital gains tax. I think they will. I think that'd be good. But she was saying that capital gains tax applies to people's homes. It doesn't. It does not apply to your first home unless it's more than 5,000 square meters, which is very few people. So they would make stuff up about him. So I totally get that. But, you know, his response to somebody laughing, I thought, is outlandish, frankly. And it says maybe something quite significant about him. But that thin-skinned response, I think, that may be a problem in government. You know, it's very high Prime Minister, and he's loved and he's gotten away with, and actually he's reaped a great deal of political capital from condemning Labour Party members, condemning ordinary people. When you're the Prime Minister, condemning, you know, regular people, I mean, it just looks kind of weird. That's been his modus operandi for the last several years. Good luck condemning the electorate every time you disagree with them if you're Prime Minister. It won't work. You'll become widely disliked quite quickly. But then, look, maybe it's just a tactic. Maybe this stuff goes in the back pocket the second he's in number 10. Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you, actually, that him saying so often, my dad's a toolmaker, my mum's a nurse, right? For people who follow politics, it's ridiculous and it's sort of a joke. But the reason you have to massively repeat stuff is because, you know, the changed Labour Party stuff as well. The reason you have to repeat stuff over and over again is because most of the public don't pay attention to politics. And especially they only start paying attention during a general election. So I actually saw sort of some polling online that was saying before the general election, 10% of the public could say what Keir Starmer's dad does. Now 25% Now 25% of the electorate can say what Keir Starmer's dad did. So clearly it is effective, and it does sort of contrast him with Rishi Sunak, who's from this very posh background. So I've actually got no problem with him repeating it all the time. I do think that sort of slandering that audience member and essentially lying about that, it was very clearly a lie about that audience member's intentions. I don't think it was thin-skinned. I think he was lying. And I suppose the thing that I do think could become Keir Starmer's downfall is how comfortable he does seem to be lying. Like, Aaron, with Boris Johnson, we used to always think, used to say people don't mind so much, that Boris Johnson lies because they don't think he takes himself that seriously anyway. But then obviously there was a limit to that, and Boris Johnson sort of lying did undo him. A serious moment arises, and then you lie about that serious moment, and then that is your downfall. And I do think that Keir Starmer has become remarkably comfortable just saying stuff that isn't true, even about just some random member of the public. And I do think that could come back to bite him.
Yeah, again, look, I'm sure there'll be keen Labour supporters, Keir supporters watching and listening to this. I hope there are. I hope there's a very broad cross-section of people watching and listening to our live shows every night. And they might think, oh God, here we go, more Keir bashing. Look, you can say, I've written an article saying how good he is at politics, right? You can't be bad at politics and turn around what he's done since 2019. You can't be. I wish we had a left-wing political figure with a left-wing agenda as ruthless as he's been, although I would like them to not fix elections. But you get my point, more or less. However, on the lying thing, Michael, this is real, and it's really worrying. Like, I don't think he understands necessarily what the truth is. I think his idea of the truth, his version of the truth, is simply whatever comes out of his mouth. And I suspect this is partly a consequence, a result of his law career, right? You know, he was in the law. You have to make an argument. A persuasive argument means you're the winner, and a persuasive argument in a court of law that wins the argument is quote unquote the truth. And I feel like Keir Starmer thinks that is what the truth is. It's whatever argument is the most persuasive in that moment. Now, the problem is, like you say, Michael, as a politician, when things are going well, when you've got momentum and you're on the way up, fine. Although I think even many journalists are sort of looking at this stuff and they're thinking, it's just kind of weird. I think lots of journalists don't really want to call him a liar, because right now you've got this period where you have to show balance, right? It's actually a big deal if you're a broadcast journalist to say he's lying, because you need somebody else to say, well, he would say he's not lying, and you know, like, it's really hard. Okay, so it's really, really, really hard to do that, given our broadcast rules around political journalism. But many political journalists I speak to are like, he lies a hell of a lot. Like, it's kind of weird. You know, even when he doesn't need to lie, he kind of lies. It seems almost compulsive. My read of that is that it goes back to his law background. And I also think he did it prodigiously for years against the Labour left, and the media just didn't kind of notice. But again, when you're in number 10 and you're doing that, if he's going to compulsively lie as PM about issues that matter to people, you know, imagine if he gets us involved in a war. It doesn't need to be a major war, a minor war, like Libya, something like that, right? Like airstrikes, and we remove somebody and something like that, along with the French and the Americans or whatever. And then there's blowback on that. You can't lie about that stuff, right? Or if service personnel die, you can't lie about that stuff. And if, you know, their parents start, you know, attacking you or start hectoring you, you can't condemn those people. He's going to make really serious, big decisions. That's what power is all about. That's what politics is all about. And some of those decisions are going to be wrong. You just have to accept that. And if he responds in this way to that happening, I think, again, he's going to be very disliked very quickly. So, of course, we're saying this and they're on the cusp of a massive majority. Yeah, fine. But things can change really quickly. And you mentioned Boris Johnson about his capacity to lie and how that wasn't really actually addressed by the media before December 2019. I feel like it's actually a very strangely similar situation with Keir Starmer.
The other interesting thing here actually is how the media acts as a herd. So if, you know, when a politician seems like they're on the way out, then suddenly all of their flaws are, you know, pounced on over and over and over again, partly because you don't need to have connections with them anymore. So, you know, lobby journalists often go a little bit easy on people who they think are the future. So Keir Starmer is the future. They want good connections with Labour because they're going to form the next government. So they're not going to go too hard on Keir Starmer. But Rishi Sunak now is the past. And that means that sort of any flaw that Rishi Sunak might have, that they might have skirted over before, now they will hammer him on. So I think if Rishi Sunak actually had told a lie like that about an audience member, it could be one of those stories that dominates the day, because they'd go and find the audience member and they say, oh my God, Rishi Sunak, what a liar again. But because this lie was told by Keir Starmer, who's on the way up, they let him get away with it. And that means that, you know, as soon as the sort of political tables are turned and Keir Starmer seems vulnerable, then these are all of the weaknesses that they will probably absolutely pounce on, and the whole thing could unravel. Let's wrap up there. Aaron, thank you for joining me on tonight's show. Always a pleasure on a Friday.
Michael, my pleasure. And just to say, the media have this strange propensity in this country. They can't hold to account more than one politician or one party at a time. Very odd. That's why Novara Media, I'd like to think, is so important.
I agree. Of course, if you do also appreciate our journalism, you can support us at novaramedia.com/support. We really do appreciate it. It helps us keep going. For now, have a good weekend. We'll see you on Monday. You've been watching Novara Media. Good night.